Thank you all for coming. This is, I mean, you see what it says, Me Too, Why Now, What's Next? I'll get to introducing the panelists. But for those of you who don't know who Legal Momentum is, as it says, it was really the Now Women's Legal Defense Fund. So we're now 50 years old, the oldest legal defense fund. And our favorite saying, and we've been true to this for 50 years, is that we believe, and that's why we're at Stanford Law School, that protecting women's and girls' rights begins with the law. Okay? All of you. So you have something to do. You have an important part to play. And you know, I'll talk about it when we talk about things we've been doing. The original author, one of the original authors of the Violence Against Women Act is sitting right here 25 years ago. Okay. And she's still our legal director. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on Legal Momentum because that's what the internet is about. You can look it up. You can look it up. That's what I love about when you do panels. You no longer have to do bios because you can look it up. So we're going to move on to the presentation. Sam, who was here in a red dress, while we're talking, she's going to hand out some, if you have a question you want to ask the panelists, afterwards you can write it down on an index card. We're going to save time for that, but as Professor Rhode says, although I know to call her Deborah, because I can, because she's on our board, we'll hand out and there'll be time for questions. So let's get started. Is Sam here? Well, she's not here. She stepped out. Well, we'll just skip it. She was going to introduce me, but I don't have to be introduced. So we're going to save an extra 30 seconds. It says, I'm the president and CEO of Legal Momentum. I spent a lot of time in California because I used to be the chief operating investment officer at CalPERS. Okay, so I know a little bit about money. But let me talk about the rest of our panelists. I don't know if you've got this flyer. I'm just going to go in the order of where people are. The great part about it is you can see the pictures. So next to me is Celinda Lake. There's a long bio about her, but she's a renowned national pollster, media commentator, and women's advancement expert. Thank you. You're welcome. Next to her is Lynn Schafran. She is our legal director, and she's the director of the National Judicial Education Program and an internationally known expert on gender bias in the courts. You know that does exist. And then, of course, everybody knows it's Professor Rhode, and she's the, well, I mean, I don't know how many books she's written. I've actually been reading a lot of your books recently, and she's the Ernest McFarlane Professor of Law Director, Center on the Legal Profession, Stanford University. I think you know where that is. So I just want to thank Deborah, and I want to thank Stanford Law School and the Stanford Center on the Legal Profession for allowing us to do this. So I skipped over you because you weren't in the room, so you don't have to do anything.
No respect.
No, I'm a respect for time.
Well, again, I'm going to stop her. Stand up, my
No, I already did that.
So I'm honored to be the Chief Strategic Officer of Legal Momentum, the nation's first and oldest legal defense fund, education fund for women. And think of the Violence Against Women Act. That was us. Think about the Protection Title VII. That's us. Think about the Protection Title IX. That's us. You can applaud. We're also very honored to have some of our board members with us. Please meet Elliot, our first vice chair. Please stand. And we have a board of directors who decided that she wanted to do more. And this is Carol Baldwin Moody, an acclaimed diversity champion, the former acting chief investment officer of CalPERS, the largest investment, am I getting it right? The largest investment thing of the human race. With an incredible corporate background and a deep dedication to women's advancement, particularly women of color, we're very honored to have Carol Baldwin Moody as our chief executive officer. Please a round of applause for Carol Baldwin.
Okay. So we're going to start off with Celinda Lake, and again, we'll have time for questions later, right?
And Carol, you told them about the questions?
I told them that if they have a question, you raise your hand, and she'll walk around, and so here's my question, okay? But feel free not to answer it. So the fallout from Me Too and the current presidential administration has galvanized the women's movement, I think. Why do you think that is? And will the change be sustained? What impact might it have on the election of women to public office? A lot of questions here. Why does the U.S. lag so far behind other democracies, given that we are now ranked 76 in the world in the number of women in elected office? Does the record number of women who have stepped forward signal a change? And what barriers do they confront that men do not? I think that's pretty meaty. Take it on.
All in 5 minutes or less. And I'm just glad you didn't ask me to solve world peace. So thank you very much. I want to say that I first worked with Legal Momentum 30 years ago, and I am just stunned at the new advances and so deeply grateful for the work that all of you do, and so impressed with Carol's leadership. So in terms of women, and obviously the Me Too movement has had a tremendous impact in terms of increasing awareness. And obviously here, it's humbling to be here in California because of the leadership that Californians have shown in such very, very adverse circumstances. That said, we've had some successes, and it's important for us to celebrate and remember our successes. We had a record number of women run, and a record number of women succeed, including particularly out of California, and that included younger women and women of color. But some of them have already paid a pretty high price, as you know from one of your own congresswomen. And I think that we are on the verge of a very, very major period of backlash that we are not prepared for in any way. And we saw it in the beginning with Kavanaugh. We have seen it legally. And Carol, I hope you will not just be a moderator, but a participant, but you were sharing with me some of the actions that Legal Momentum is taking.
Backlash. Yeah.
We have seen a record number of women run for president, and a record number of people of color run. But we have also seen a pretty fast attrition, and it is really interesting, frankly, and disturbing that the women are dropping out at a much faster rate than the men, and having a harder time raising money, having a harder time getting endorsements, even though they're doing it in record amounts. And the freeing of even within the Democratic primary, of the candidacies, the ability of candidates to go after the women candidates in what is, and women operatives in a pretty disturbing fashion. I would just counsel you to two places to look is, one, what happened to Elizabeth Warren after she revealed that Bernie Sanders had said, you know, a woman can't win. The kind of social media that was launched against her. And currently in Nevada, which is a hot and heavy primary, as you know, right next door to you, the two women of color heads of the culinary union are being treated to a level of violence and social media that really is unprecedented in politics for their opposition to the Medicare for All healthcare plan. So even within the Democratic primary, we are seeing, and that's before we even get to Trump, we are going to see in this election two things that are going to be very, very important. One thing is it will be women who determine who is president of the United States. There's no question about that. And as progressives and as Democrats, we have to win women by more than we lose men by, and we will lose men today. But we have to win women by more. And the people that know that better than anybody are the Republicans, the conservatives. Kellyanne Conway, who is a nationally recognized expert on women voters. I wrote a book with her actually a decade ago, What Women Really Want. The Trump women are operative, they are well funded, they are communicating every week, they have spent a record amount of money on social media. We will see women very energized on the right. The second question is how energized are progressive and younger women going to be? Trump has already launched what he called the wasted vote program. They don't even try to camouflage what they're doing anymore. So the wasted vote program has a stated goal of getting a third of millennials and Gen Zers, and a third of particularly younger men of color, but a third of people of color to vote for third-party candidates or to skip the presidential ballot. They know they can't win on their merits, so they plan to win on the lesser of two evils. And by defining and so negatively whichever opponent they face, that a bunch of young people don't turn out to vote or skip the presidential ballot or vote for third-party candidates. And that could cost us the election. There's no question that could cost us the election, particularly with the Electoral College. So the stakes are really, really high right now. And I'm not sure that our side's organization is up to the momentum of the other side. The second thing we see is that we are still having remarkable debates, and I'm so honored to be on this panel, particularly with Deborah, because I too have read her books, or some of her books. I don't want to be quizzed on them though. One of the things that is just astounding right now is that we are in a major legal brawl on things like reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act, and the ERA. These are things that the public's on board. The public is way ahead of our elite structure. There is not a public controversy about reauthorization of VAWA. There is not a public controversy about the ERA. But we can't get these things through our current institutions, and then we wonder why our voters are discouraged and don't want to vote. So it is a very, very, very disturbing time. There are all kinds of institutional reforms that would promote more women in office and that would promote more diversity, more young people in office. But I have to say, and this I will take a moment of personal privilege if I may, I don't care what your issue is. Probably if you're in here right now, gender is a big part of your issue. But no matter what your issue is, if you want to see your issue promoted, if you want to see your issue succeed, you have to support campaign finance reform as your #1 issue. It is rotting out the system, the way that money is raised right now, the way that money can be spent. And that is a big difference between our system and other systems. There are experiments right now. California's been a leader in experiments with how we vote, like ranked choice voting, which you have in San Francisco right next door. There's no question that women do better with ranked choice voting. There is ranked choice voting in the Nevada caucuses, in the early vote of the Nevada caucuses, and we'll see how that works out. But there are a lot of people amassing against ranked choice voting. We do better with proportional representation, but the number of places and states that have proportional representation has actually declined, not increased. And we clearly do better under parliamentary systems, which we are not going to have. There are a lot of structural reforms which need to be in place to actually advance women. And finally, my last point, and I want to acknowledge Sam for being a leader in this. So I'm going to give you lots of tasks today. One of them is to join an organization. After you support Legal Momentum, you need to join an organization called Name It, Change It, named by Gloria Steinem, started by Sam in another life. The way that women are treated on social media, women office holders, women operatives, whether they're heads of labor unions or pollsters, frankly, women bloggers. I don't know if any of you follow the woman blogger Digby, who talks about before she revealed her gender, how much differently she was treated because people assumed Digby was a man. And then she revealed she was a woman, and the kind of violence and sexuality in her responses that she gets when people disagree with her. Name It, Change It calls out sexism in the media. For Democrats, Republicans, Green Party, whatever party, because sexism hurts all of us, and then responds to it. And very, very, from the grassroots level, very, very important effort. But the social media is insane right now in terms of the way that it treats women. So that's just a little bit, and glad to turn it back to other members.
Well, Professor Rhode, before I ask your question, is there any quick comments you want to make to what Celinda said, or can I
Go right ahead.
go with my question? That's okay? All right then, so back to the books. You have long written about the no problem, the failure to recognize gender inequality as a serious issue. What accounts for this failure, and do you think the current moment signals a major change? What do you think are the most significant challenges facing American women?
Well, Gloria Steinem famously predicted that the truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off. That's great. I think Me Too, hashtag Me Too Illustrated, we're clearly at the pissed off stage. That's major progress, but we need to get to the truth stage too. For centuries, women have suffered the kind of discrimination and harassment that are the focus of recent activism, but had neither a label or a remedy. When I was in college, we didn't even have a term for sexual harassment, little complaint channels. We just talked about having a problem with your professor, and of course the problem is always yours, never his. And that's begun to change in the 1980s, but as we recently registered, it's remained persistent and pervasive, and women who have complained have been dismissed, have been silenced, and punished. And I'm hopeful that this latest cultural consciousness raising is going to change the legal landscape. And one reason I'm hopeful is the increasing interest by the mainstream media and the power of social media. Journalists, of course, have always known that sex sells, but now there's widespread recognition that so does sexual abuse. The authors who broke the Harvey Weinstein story earned a Pulitzer Prize, published blockbusting articles and bestsellers, and there's plenty more material where that came from. Social media and attention has had all the negative consequences that Celinda just mentioned, but it's had some good consequences too, in the way that it's enabled women to bypass unresponsive legal processes and human relations offices and go straight to the public. Susan Fowler's blog about being propositioned by a supervisor on her first day of work at Uber and then getting dissed by the company's HR went viral. And it led to an investigation by former Attorney General Eric Holder that toppled the careers of 20 executives in that company. In my own profession, law, serial abusers who often escape serious sanctions when law firms sign secrecy agreements and then let them move to another organization or firm without disclosing the circumstances, now face the real possibility of being outed. In one of my favorite recent examples, feminists at one law firm engaged in self-help. They sent a large bouquet of flowers to a firm that didn't vet a new partner and had a history of harassment charges, and they included a large card saying, "Thanks for taking him, signed the women." The firm relatedly did an investigation, and he was forced to resign the following week. I think other progress in the wake of hashtag #MeToo has come in increasing access to legal help for the least powerful women, particularly low-income workers and women of color who can't afford to sue and can't really economically weather a retaliatory job dismissal. More resources are targeting them. Organizations like Legal Momentum run hotlines that provide advice and referrals. More legislators are finding ways to block secrecy agreements in cases of serial abuse. And more employees, including law students at schools like Stanford, are boycotting employers who require confidential arbitration processes to resolve harassment complaints. Well, of course, a lot more needs to be done, and I have some of Celinda Lake's concerns about whether we're going to be able to marshal people in anywhere near the numbers we need to sustain the recent progress we've made. But we at least have more opportunities to move in the right direction, and hoping that all of the people in this audience are going to help us on that journey.
Thank you. I do want to say, you mentioned one of our biggest pillars in Legal Momentum looks at the most vulnerable women. I mean, you know, immigrant, low-income women of color. We spend a lot of time on it, as you say. And as you said, we have a helpline, which is really, it's really the earliest intervention you can have. It's all 50 states you can call in, and it's really made a big difference. One thing I can say, and I was talking to Celinda about this, part of the issue with the Me Too is we sort of anticipated some of the backlash that has happened because of Me Too movement. So what has happened, we just had to do a 50-state defamation law research, because unfortunately what's happening is the accusers are now bringing defamation lawsuits against the accused. And we knew that was going to happen, and they're not prepared for it. And it's a state law-based thing. And so we try, when people call our helpline, saying, in your state, this is where you need to go. But things like that are something that, you know, people weren't prepared for. You know, so, thank you. And I don't know if you want to say something, Lynn, or can I move on to your question? We have time. So, despite almost 40 years, and I think, how old is NJP? You don't have to say it.
No, established in 1980, so you can do the math.
Okay. Despite almost 40 years of focus on gender bias and gender fairness across the spectrum of civil, criminal, and family law, your work is as relevant now as it was decades ago. Can you provide examples from any current cases that help us understand just how deep and intractable this challenge is, and then more importantly, what's the solution?
Well, first of all, I want to say, some of you are noticing that I'm squirming a little bit and sitting in an odd angle. There is a great deal of equipment here. If I face you, I will turn it all off with my knee.
Sorry. Let's just 19%.
We're a high-tech operation.
Sorry about that. So, thank you, Celinda. So Exhibit A, if any of you have seen this in the press, you might know that Exhibit A is New Jersey. It came to light late last year that several judges in New Jersey had said some really terrible things in rape cases. And, okay. Just yell out if you can't hear. I brought this so I would quote them accurately because I wouldn't want to miss a word of this. So, 16-year-old high school student films himself raping a clearly intoxicated girl, circulates the video with the caption, "When your first time having sex was rape." And then this comes to light in a situation where the district attorney's office wants to make it possible to try this 16-year-old girl, the 16-year-old guy, as an adult because of what he's done to this girl. So this is what we have from Judge Troiano. This young man comes from a good family who put him in an excellent school where he was doing extremely well. His scores for college entry sound familiar? Very high, very high. He is clearly a candidate for not just college, but probably a good college. And then he went on to castigate the prosecutors for not counseling the victim that pursuing the case could ruin this young man's life. Now, Judge Troiano was, actually at that point, he was a retired judge who was called back to serve, as happens a lot. My own state of New York, we have a deadline, and if you are of a certain age, you must retire, and then you can be certified for another 2 years, and that's the end of it. But people do come back because there's always a shortage and so on. So he has now taken the option of permanent retirement. The other judges are before the Judicial Disciplinary Committee. So here's another 16-year-old boy, and he's accused of raping a 12-year-old girl. And in this case, I really cannot decide which was more operative in this judge's mind. And I bring to the floor that this is a woman judge speaking, so don't have any illusions about putting more women on the bench, that it will get you where you want to go, or an elective office, or any place else. It's what are people's principles and values and motives, not necessarily are they girls or boys, right?
Right.
So, this is a 16-year-old boy. He is accused of raping a 12-year-old girl. In denying a motion to try him as an adult, Judge Marcia Silva wrote, "The victim did not suffer any physical or emotional injuries as a result, other than the ramifications of losing her virginity, which the court does not find to be especially serious in this case." She also said that even if the girl's claim was true, quote, "the offense is not an especially heinous or cruel offense beyond the elements of the crimes. Beyond losing her virginity, the state didn't claim that the victim suffered any further injuries," and so on. Anyway, the appellate court had a few things to say about that, and she is now before the Judicial Disciplinary Committee. I knew as soon as I read this that this little girl, was probably a young woman of color. And I knew it because many years ago, a very famous and quite extraordinary sociologist named Gary Lafrede had the opportunity to interview in person for 90 minutes each 350 Indianapolis citizens who had sat as jurors in cases recently in Indianapolis. And he and his colleagues wrote a fascinating book about it. And there was one case out of all of them that has always stayed in my mind. And that is a situation where the victim was a 13-year-old girl, and the juror said, well, she was probably from a bad neighborhood anyway. Read the rest of the text. You can follow along. So I made some discrete inquiries, and I found out that I was right, that this little girl was a little girl of color, and nobody wants to call this judge out as a racist, but they're willing to call her out as a sexist, which I think is very interesting. Then we have the case of the judge who, pressing a woman who, she's seeking a restraining order against the father of her 5-year-old daughter, told the judge that the man had sexually assaulted her and threatened her life. The judge insistently demanded the details. Do you know how to stop somebody from having intercourse with you? Block your body parts, close your legs. Now, there's more, believe it or not. But I will say kudos to the chief judge of New Jersey, because people were irate across the state. And he immediately convened what, of course, is now called Starbucks Day. Closed all the courts in New Jersey, except the municipal courts, made everybody come to a full-day presentation. My colleague and I were 2 of the presenters. And, kudos to him. Who knows what will happen or what will come out of all of that. I think some people will change the things that they did, and some people will know not to say it out loud. Right? Isn't that the way it works? So I want to move from the individuals, because I want to tell you about an organization that I think you need to watch really carefully. And it's called the American Law Institute. And the American Law Institute thinks very highly of itself, and I'm a member. I probably shouldn't say bad things about it. So in its mission statement, the American Law Institute says, I should tell you, it has about 3,000 members, I think, is that right? And it's a third, and a third. A third judges, a third practicing lawyers, a third legal academics. Its mission, this is on this website, to clarify, modernize, or otherwise improve the law to promote the better administration of justice. Many years ago, this project has been going on since 2012 to update the Model Penal Code on sex offenses. When it was proposed, I thought, great, we really need to bring this 1962 code up to date. We need to make it reflect what we now know about victim behavior in the context of terribly threatening situations. And I want to say, even though we're getting challenged on the reality of the science, is tonic immobility real? It's real. If you would like any of the sources that Harvard publishes or anybody else, it's not about women, it's not about men, it's not about sexual violence. When you are in a terrifying situation, your brain chooses for you. You don't choose, your brain chooses for you what you need to do in that moment to survive. And you actually know something about this. You don't realize that you do. Just think about the phrase, deer in the headlights, what does the deer do next? Playing possum, why would an animal play dead, etc. So we're being challenged around what we thought this project would bring to light in many ways. But perhaps the worst thing that has come out, and there's a lot in this project that is, I may literally have to take my name off this project because there's no minority report, and I don't know that I ever want to be associated with this. But number one, and what I really want to bring to your attention, is that there's a definition of consent that's been adopted, and it revives resistance. Now, most of you in this room are too young to know that resistance was once standard in sexual assault law. And after decades of fighting by people in this room and related, suddenly resistance has revived. So, consent for purposes of Article 213 means a person's willingness to engage in a specific fact of sexual penetration or consent. And then there's B, blah, blah. Now C, neither verbal nor physical resistance is required to establish that consent is lacking, but their absence may be considered in the context of all the circumstances in determining whether there was consent. Now there's the elephant in the room, right? If anybody established a piece of legislation that had the word resistance in it, you know that that's going to be a big issue. Now, you are in the yes means yes state. And I will tell you that many of us who belong to ALI tried very hard for an affirmative consent standard. Obviously, we did not win. Frankly, my hope is that when this project is done and it emerges, people will see that it is so retrograde and so behind where the culture is. As you said, Celinda, 90% of people who want the ERA and so on, that this will simply not be any basis for people to pass legislation. But in terms of solutions, I cite this because people need to really pay attention. And everybody has to be paying attention to everything. I know that sounds impossible because we're all selective readers. But you probably know in your own circle, your own family, who pays attention to what. You can, draw folks' attention to the fact that this is going on. What might you be able to do about it? Take nothing for granted. I can tell you that I read a few years ago, and I've actually reread a quite wonderful book by Betty Roberts, who was the first woman on the Oregon Supreme Court, and she'd previously been a state legislator. And when you read the legislation that went through the Oregon legislature like a knife through hot butter in the 70s, you gasp. Because today we are going in the other direction. So we cannot take for granted one single thing that we have ever accomplished. Because as you can see, the fact that resistance has reappeared in the ALI definition of consent, very, very unnerving.
And you said it, and we all said it, we can't take it for granted. We've fought long and hard, we've done lots of things, but every single day, all the things, Title VII, Title IX, all of it, we are fighting every single day. So I'm going to actually open up to all three panelists because I have an opportunity to ask, three nationally renowned.
And Carol, if I could, if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask, just raise your hand and we'll bring you a piece of paper to write the question down. Okay, so
This is the time. This is the time. So here's the important thing. And each of you, and I'll say who we're going to start with. What must we focus on in the decade to come to move women's equality forward? Okay? Pretty simple question. You said world peace? Okay. Close. And what are strategically the most important issues? The most important issues we must focus on to create the greatest improvements for all women and girls. Celinda.
I think we need to do three things. I think number one, we have to beat Donald Trump. Right now, I will tell you, I think he has a 60% chance of getting reelected. So unless you plan on seceding from the union, eyes on the prize. We have to get rid of Donald Trump. And what's really sobering, and actually Deborah and Lynn and Carol are much more expert on this than I am, is the amount, the number of people they are feeding into the bureaucracy, the number of judges that they are appointing. This legacy will last for our lifetime, and the Supreme Court, of course. The second thing we need to do is, and I think you raised a really good point, Lynn, it's not just the values, but we have to make our elected bodies more representative. It does make a difference when women serve, and we have a lot of studies now that document that men and women, different legislation gets introduced, different legislation gets passed when women are in these offices and in these bodies. And so across the board, and even in places that you think are very, very good for electing women, like California, you have here an organized effort called Close the Gap, so go online if you haven't seen it, to try to catch up with electing women. And even when we make progress, a few years ago, we were one seat away from having the entire city council, which is very powerful, in Los Angeles be male. after making progress after progress. So it's one step forward and two step backwards. And three, we have to protect a woman's right to choose. And I think that issue is extremely threatened. We've heard a lot about violence and sexual harassment, et cetera, so I won't even add to that. But the one issue that I haven't heard us talk enough about is protecting a woman's right to choose and reproductive health. And it is stunning what they are running. So in the Virginia State Legislature, we did those races. We were lucky enough to win and win control, win with women. But they ran so-called protect aborted babies ads and late abortion ads. And they don't even say, they say abortion on the last day of delivery. They show pictures of kindergartners. So we let them get through kindergarten, put them back in utero, and then kill them. That's what they're suggesting. It's ridiculous. And yet, when we did the testing on that, voters were like, I want an answer to this. This is a very serious charge. Not, this is unbelievable, ridiculous, I'm going to reject this. It was like, no, I want an answer from the politician on this. I think this is very possible that this would happen. I want to know what the answer is. So those are my three.
Okay. I don't know, Professor Rhode, do I need to repeat the question?
No, I got it.
Are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right then.
So I have three too. First, I think we need more Americans to make these issues a political priority and to channel the outrage that erupted in the Women's March and the 2018 election turnouts towards sustainable structural change. Second, I think we need to focus on women who need help most and have the least resources to obtain it. That's low income, predominantly women of color. Their issues often fall through the cracks because they aren't seen as a powerful political force. They don't have the capacity to make donations to candidates or nonprofit groups. And so I think those of us who have more leverage need to look for those intersectional issues where gender inequalities are compounded by race, class, sexual orientation, immigration status, and so forth, and that includes reproductive justice. And finally, women need to be more, and men who support this agenda need to be more strategic. Friends and family keep giving me these coffee cups and t-shirts with historian Laurel Ulrich's famous quote, "Well-behaved women seldom make history," which is true. But it's also the case that badly behaved women who aren't strategic about where and how they protest are often burned at the stake. So we need to pick our battles. We need to fight on multiple fronts. We need to write more checks, organize more potential voters, and pushing legislators and judges and the general public. A century ago, the newspaper editor William White advised women to raise more hell and fewer dollars. It remains good advice, and I thank all of you for being here to share it and think about how we can all help us move forward.
I look to you, Lynn.
Okay, well, not just because I was involved in the Violence Against Women Act in 1990, but I do think we need to understand how extraordinarily important the issue of violence is in women's lives and the lives of their children. I said before, everybody's a selective reader, right? I mean, I can open the New York Times any day and tell you on page 4 there'll be incest, and on page 12 somebody, this and that and the other thing. I can read books. I try to find books that don't have this stuff in it. Would you believe that I read a memoir that Jimmy Carter wrote years ago about his friendship with a child and so on and so on, and then all of a sudden, his sister, Gloria, I remember this woman's name, marries some hotshot Air Force pilot who beats the hell out of her, and fortunately she came right home and her father got an annulment. But if you pay attention, what you see is that in the workplace, at home, as a child watching your mother being beaten, this is so pervasive, and it has such an impact on lives going forward. People carry this. Are any of you familiar with ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences Study? Okay, well, you have in your state a wonderful new Surgeon General, and you need to look her up. And she, right now, has a program. Every child in California is being screened for trauma. And one of the issues that comes up in the scale in adverse childhood experiences study, it's a simple questionnaire and so on, is, did you see your mother, stepmother being beaten? How does that affect your life going forward? You might have a heart attack when you're 40 because when you were growing up, you watched the violence in your home. If you have a job and you can't leave that job, and I would say there's no question that the issues for women who are in low-wage jobs there are definitely different issues there. But I really think it's important that these are issues everywhere. You cited this law firm where the women sent the card and said, thank you for taking it, right? So no matter where you are in the economic scale, if you have a job, you are vulnerable, if you need it. And even if you don't, do you want to walk away? You don't want to walk away because there are parts of the job that you want. And if you can't stay in that job, you're going to lose it. You're going to lose the money, you're going to lose the promotional opportunity, whatever it is. There is actually right now a federal judicial opinion from one of the federal district courts in Pennsylvania that says that it is gender bias to teach academic disciplinary committees that most sexual assaults are committed by someone the victim knows, and that sexual violence is far more prevalent than people think. I am not making that up because that is based on something that I wrote. A number of years ago, we published something called Judges Tell, What I Wish I Had Known Before I Presided in an Adult Victim Sexual Assault Case. Consultant to Penn, University of Pennsylvania, came across that in the course of developing materials for their academic disciplinary committee. She asked us, can we use that? I said, of course. The next thing you know, this young man is found to have violated the, I should indeed. Anyway, this young man is found responsible. He turns around apropos of defamation. He sues the school. Penn's, they settled with this kid before I could get in and intervene in an appeal or whatever. But we actually have it on the books that, you know, real facts are now gender bias ipso facto, right? So this issue undergirds so much in women's lives and to some extent men's as well. But we really need to make this an issue that we give a lot of serious attention to and not just say it's over there or it doesn't carry on for life.
Oh, well, thank you, Lynn, and thank you to the panelists. Please, a round of applause for our panelists. We've got so many wonderful questions. Our mechanism is going to be that we'll listen to a few of them. Carol will ask the panelists. The rest of the questions will be typed up. We will ask our panelists for their answers. And if you haven't yet given us your email address and you would like to participate in these answers, please do so to myself or my constricted daughter, Emma, in the corner here. And we'll make sure that you get these answers from our esteemed panelists. Carol, we have two questions I think we have time to answer.
Well, I mean, one of them might take all day. So, but let's start with this one. And I know, I think everybody, certainly Professor Rhode and Lynn will have something to say about this. And you know, how does, and somebody has in quotes, you know, as a law student, how does due process work in sexual assault cases? How does it work? And particularly in college campus, how does it work? What's due process?
Well, on college campuses, there's a fight about that right now under Title IX regulations. Under the Obama administration, there was pressure on college campuses to not have an elevated proof requirement in campus assault cases, because if you force people to prove this, once we did here at Stanford, beyond a reasonable doubt or by clear and convincing evidence, most of these cases where there are obviously no witnesses and there's no compulsory subpoena power, they'll never succeed. So most campuses shifted to a preponderance of the evidence case. Now the Trump administration has withdrawn that letter, so many campuses are thinking about shifting back. There's also a question about how much procedural due process both complainants and those accused of sexual assault deserve. I think it's really important here to not minimize the potential harms for people who are accused of sexual assaults. And, you see a lot of feminists sort of saying, well, worst case, they have to apply to a different college. Being labeled a rapist will be on your record forever. You'll be forced to register as a sex offender, so it's a really serious charge, and we need to take procedural due process seriously. There are obviously campuses where that hasn't happened. But there are plenty of campuses where the pendulum is now swinging in the wrong direction, and we aren't protecting those who come forward from retaliation. We aren't creating a structure in which they can give candid testimony, sometimes without directly confronting their accuser. So, we don't have time to get into the nuances, but I just think we need a really careful analysis of how to be fair to both sides in these cases where there's so much at stake. We know that less than 10% of victims of campus sexual assault come forward. And unless we create a system in which they really feel that they'll be protected and there's a reasonable chance something will be done about the assault if the person is found responsible, we're never going to make progress on this issue.
Thank you.
Well, only to add that it is really problematic that these disciplinary committees are often constructed in a way that one side or the other has the opportunity to be heard and the other doesn't. Or one side has a professional lawyer holding their hand, the other side doesn't. And the question of parity of how you're going to appear before these disciplinary bodies, how you're going to be treated, what kind of support you're going to have, what kind of professional guidance you're going to be able to get is critical. And that's the kind of due process that is really lacking in so many of these situations.
So here's a good question, and we had to weigh in on this one. The question is, so how do we get these issues discussed more in the presidential primary debates? I mean, nobody's really talking about these issues. I know we, along with NOW, sent a list of 8 questions to Rachel Maddow and others saying these are questions that are not being talked about. And Celinda, I really want to look to you. How come they're not talking about these issues?
It's really frustrating. I think this whole debate process really needs to be reconsidered. But let me say this. I think that I am despairing, honestly, of influencing the debate process. I mean, I think the groups have done a really, really good job. And I don't care what issue, the climate change, the economy, immigration. I mean, we could go on, and a lot of groups feel the same frustration. But these candidates are barreling into these states. It'll be a little different on Super Tuesday, but right now, in the next 10 days or so, there is real opportunity. They are in lots of forums, and we should think about, contact your friends at the University of Nevada Law School and tell them to go into these forums and pose the question of all of the candidates. They are very, very accessible. They all have Q&A periods. They don't dare turn down the voters right now because they don't want a bad story. So I would say this, I think that the candidates and their events are far more permeable, honestly, than these national debates are. And the entire press corps is following these candidates around. So people think, well, I don't want to go to an obscure event in South Carolina. Well, Elizabeth Warren poses a question or answers a question well in an obscure event in South Carolina. It's all over AP, it's all over the press. So I despair, honestly, of influencing the debate process. I think it's very frustrating. But I think you can access these candidates and get this question planted. And if a question spontaneously comes out at 4 different events, the press corps will write something about it.
Okay, that's anybody else want to comment on that?
Good answer.
Okay, here's another question. Let me read it. In the She Said book exposing the Weinstein story, the New York Times writers talked extensively about the role lawyers played in helping Weinstein silence victims or defending him. As someone going into the legal profession, I'm anxious about the future of this field. How do I view or interact with lawyers who defend thieves?
Great question.
Well, everyone's
everyone's entitled to it, to the defense. I mean, that's the basic premise of American law. However, what I thought that the writer might be getting at, what is so disturbing about the lawyers, there are many things that are disturbing about all lawyers in this case, but when you find out that people who are at the top of our profession
Right.
and highly regarded
Feminists.
are hiring spies, literally hiring spies to go around and intimidate the victims, the press, and so on. It really does not speak well for our profession. There is the concept of zealous defense, and then there's something else.
Well, you know, I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times about the shameful performance of David Boyce and his firm on this. He did exactly what Lynn said. And, you know, it is one thing to be defending somebody in a criminal charge, and, you know, we're very committed to giving everyone effective access to counsel when their lives and liberty are at risk. But, you know, Boyce was involved in a civil matter and hiring this firm to dig up dirt against Weinstein's accusers and the reporters who were covering it. And, you know, that should just be beyond the pale, and he's issued a kind of half apology. Well, maybe I, you know, should pay more attention. And, you know, so I think, and he's not the only one. Some of you may know that Gloria Allred's daughter, who styled herself, Lisa Long, as a feminist, was engaged in silencing some of Weinstein's abusers, and the New York Times author's book recounts the memo she sent to Harvey Weinstein saying, here's all the ways, you know, that we can, you know, Google trash her, or Google bomb her and trash her reputation and so forth. So, yeah, I think we're a profession that needs to do a little more self-scrutiny about what we're going to do to, you know, make a buck or get an appearance on national television.
Good? Okay, I'm switching gears a little bit because the questions are, well, look at this question, you tell me whether I want to ask it or not.
Oh, man. Whoever, this is, who could beat Donald Trump? The minute you figure this out, will you let me know? I am going heartfeltly to that campaign.
I had to just put it over there. I didn't even touch it.
I asked her that before.
Okay, go ahead. I don't want to
We
go
all
ahead.
want to know, Celinda.
Yeah, so that's the question.
Okay.
Is there consensus? I don't know. There's your
Good
question.
question, man. Somebody's got their eye on the prize.
Okay, I'll pass over that question, but it's out there. And here's one more technical question, because we are at a law school, and we have some great lawyers up here. And it's an interesting one. It says, suppose you don't believe, and I know you have opinions on this, suppose you don't believe that 16-year-olds should be prosecuted as adults. Suppose you don't believe, then how can you make the rape cases serious if they're not prosecuted as adults?
How long do we have?
Well,
yeah, no, it's a real
It's a
question.
great question.
It's a real
Because,
question.
you know,
It is a
And
real
it's what
question.
the public will have.
for you know, centuries we didn't take rape cases seriously, and you know,
Right.
the cases that Lynn mentioned are truly appalling. But we live in a country of mass incarceration, and we put juvenile offenders away from life for some of these crimes. Without possibility for parole, you know, that's just not, and they're disproportionately people of color. That's who gets.
But not in sexual assault cases. I think people are very confused about that. This is going on in a level of madness at the American Law Institute again. But obviously, over-incarceration is a huge problem. But just in this particular slice of criminality, that's not the issue.
Which is the answer to that? It's
Right.
not over incarceration, or it's not people going?
No, it isn't. This is not working against people of color. It is working across the board or not working at all. I mean, that's the issue. In sexual violence law, almost nobody, I mean, there is very specific and high-quality data on attrition. So, first we start out that almost nobody reports. Of the few people who do report, they're very often so badly treated by the police, they're not going forward. And the police may not even forward their case to the prosecutor. The prosecutor may abuse them as well and then mark them down as uncooperative and close the case. Some tiny, tiny, tiny percentage will get to court. And maybe there'll be a plea and maybe there'll be a trial. The odds on winning a trial are not good. My heart is in my mouth over this Weinstein case. It's going to go to the jury next week. You know, and if the 100 women who have made allegations against him could testify, we might have something different. But in our system, we don't allow that because we say you shouldn't be convicted of this crime because you did all those others and you have a propensity to commit that kind of crime. So the judge only allowed 2 witnesses to speak to what are called prior bad acts. Now, in the Bill Cosby case, the judge allowed 5 other women to testify against Cosby. And that was because the Pennsylvania Supreme Court had, in the interval between the 2 cases, et cetera, they had made a decision that said you could have 5 prior bad act witnesses. The fact that for women, you know, 1 woman's word is not enough. You have to have 100 line up, and then it gets serious. Excuse me. But this is going back to this age thing. This is a very, very difficult and serious question. So usually, the statute will say, tried under juvenile law unless the individual has committed a crime of serious violence and so on. So there is an effort to treat these cases somewhat differently. But now in New York, we just went through this thing called Raise the Age, so that young people who are dealing with any kind of crime will not just be automatically dealt with as if they were adults. There's no question that, none of us had a properly connected brain until we were in maybe our early 20s. That's what the neuroscience tells us. And boys get there a little later than girls. So we are all maturing at a rate that is doesn't match the way the law works. And the Supreme Court, having decided that it is not going to allow these cases anymore, where someone who's committed a very serious felony as a young person can be put away for life without parole and so on and so on. And in those cases, they accepted the neuroscience. That was part of what came in. I don't know if it came in the parties' briefs or whatever, but there were a lot of briefs from people who were professional neuroscientists about how the human brain matures. And so this question of culpability and punishment and possible resilience, there's data that says that if you deal with young people who are going down this particular path, when they are young, you have a better chance of minimizing recidivism than you do with adults. That's, not surprising. That should kind of be common sense, but it's not. In just the way that if someone is victimized, the sooner you can get that person into really quality therapy, the better chance they have of moving on with their lives. Because the fact is, the brain is plastic, and it is most plastic when people are young. But these are hard cases, and the question of what you do when the offender, in these very serious cases that I just described to you, how they ought to be dealt with. Excuse me. But obviously there are provisions for young people to be placed in some kind of either a treatment facility or something that will provide the opportunity for education and therapy and so on to minimize recidivism. But it's definitely an issue that people are very concerned with.
I think we have time for one more question that's interesting, and I take it for legal momentum because it is directed somewhat at legal momentum. It says, how might you pull into your organization and messaging men who have been victims and to more deeply reach your audience? And if you see anything on our website, we talk about the percentage of men who are victims. And one of the things we're doing now is we have a peer educator program that started off just teaching young girls about how to have healthy relationships and what to deal with abusive relationships. And this year, we expanded it, and it's now, we have the same number of men in the program, and it's really changed the dynamics of that peer educator program, because people are shocked when we tell them the percentage of victims that are men. And so I don't know, Lynn, I know you know those,
Well, not only do I
percentages.
know that, I mean, this is something that at NJP, the National Judicial Education Program, we always talk about male victims, and people were very surprised we talk about female victims, male victims, the LGBT community. We talk about the very high incidence of victimization of Native Americans. We really try to educate people about all the different people who are being victimized in this way. And there's no question that people are very, very surprised. This is a story, but this is just like, how surprised can you be? Many, many years ago, I had a phone call from a judge in New York, and she said, Lynn, is it true that male victims of rape don't have PTSD like women do? I said, what? So she said, well, I have this case in which this guy was convicted of burglarizing someone's house. And it's up for sentencing, and the DA's office is saying that his claim that he did it in retaliation for this guy raping him doesn't wash, because even if he was victimized, it's no big deal for men. So I said, not quite right.
There you go.
That's really-
Well, we know that male victims both of sexual assault and domestic violence are much less likely to report it because their complaints are taken seriously. There's a certain cultural stereotype that says, you're a wimp if you let that happen to you. And there aren't nearly enough good shelters that are open to men. So we have a lot of work to do to recognize the extent of the problem, and especially among LGBT individuals, where the rates of sexual abuse are much higher than for other groups.
So I'm going to end on a question, and I'll put you back in the spot, Celinda. Sorry, but I'm putting you back in the spot. So even though we don't have any confidence in getting the issues raised at the debate, the question is, for which candidate is strongest on these issues?
A really good point.
Okay.
And I would love for you all to take that question, but and maybe Lynn has scanned the websites of them. I would say three things. I think number one, none of these candidates is as strong as they should be on. And part of it is because right now they would have, these candidates honestly will talk about anything that will get them elected. And I don't mean that they'll take any position, quite contrary. I mean, a lot of them have very thoughtful plans and have really thought about where they stand on the issues. But I mean, they're really under the gun right now. They're really trying to win votes, and they will respond to whatever voters raise for them. The second thing I will think of is there isn't a candidate in America right now that thinks that these issues are the issues to get them elected. They don't think they need to talk to them, and even ones that have strong platforms or ones that have strong records or historically were strongest on these issues, even ones that have polling data in front of them which says these issues test very strongly, do not think that they need to talk about these issues to win elections. And that's what we've got to change.
And
And the
they're right,
public,
aren't they?
pardon?
And they're right.
Maybe they're right, maybe they're not. I mean, what's really frustrating here is the dislocation between our political system. A lot of people say, I've never been so discouraged about voters. I actually am not discouraged about voters. I'm discouraged about the system. I've never seen the system serve voters so poorly. And so I think candidates could win votes by being strong on these issues. I think the public is way ahead of our electoral systems right now. I mean, you're right, there are some gender biases. We've looked at this a lot. There are some gender biases in terms of domestic violence and things like that, but nothing like what the elites assume there to be. And when you ask VAWA is held up right now over guns, over LGBTQ, and expanding it to Native Americans. None of that is remotely controversial with voters.
Yeah, no.
If voters were in charge, they would pass the damn thing out right now. Even people who don't support gun control think it is ridiculous to hold up VAWA because you think this is some backdoor way into gun control. I think the issue is we have to get these issues raised more. And the politicians will only be as good as we demand them to be, honest.
Beautiful answer.
Yes. Well, I'm looking at the time. I want to thank everybody that
Thank you for
attended.
your great.
Yes, and as Sam said, we have some questions and we will, if you want them answered, we will give it the email, we will get them out. Thank you all for spending the
Thank
day
you,
with us.
everyone.
And get out there.